Okay, now thank you so much for that talk, Zan. Welcome to the stage. We've already got several questions in for you, so I suppose I'll just get it going. I think you might be muted right now. I want to unmute your mic. I've done that so many times today.
There we go.
Okay, there we go. Yeah, perfect. Okay, cool. So I'll just kick it off. First of all, what led you to coming up with these three tools? Were there like particular projects that made them like solidify for you?
Honestly, so I got started in data visualization when I was a data analyst. And in 2011, I took a workshop led by Cole of storytelling with data, like a precursor to storytelling with data. And I'd been making charts for years. Like I'd been an analyst for a while at that point. But that was the first time I was like, oh, like this is a thing. Like data viz is a thing. And I'm pretty sure that she touched on all three of these things, like in that original workshop. So in some ways, I'm like, I'm kind of just like saying the same things that I learned in 2011. But I really think that like over the years, my understanding has like, I do think I've learned something. And my understanding has really been refined and really coming to see, especially the last, so from 2017 to 2021, I was working with a team of scientists. And at first I was kind of like building tools for them, and more I was like advising and prototyping for them so that they could bring it more viz into their own work. And it was really seeing how I kept coming back to these as things that not only were they like useful for Viz, but this place where it really was also about like how do you bring your own understanding into how you're making the chart. And it feels like in particular like being able to make decisions about like, well, when do you like what does the color mean, and like how do I encode meaning into the color so I like if I know that greater than 10 is important, like that's means something. And same thing with what we just saw in the example of like you don't have to have like not every state needs its own chart, but if you're like, oh, I want to compare like New York and California and everything else, that's a way of thinking about like what have I learned that's important from the data or from the domain context coming in to make that decisions about like, okay, which ones do I actually split out as a small multiple? And same thing with order. I think order is one where like sometimes it just happens automatically that like the data itself is ordered, so you kind of get order for free. And in that case, you don't really have to think about it. On the other hand, I think there's a lot of situations where like if you don't get order for free, if it like it goes alphabetical and alphabetical is like not actually what's meaningful,
Sure.
then having a mismatch order is like really makes it unreadable, and as we saw with that example. So yeah, I think these just like they just like I keep going to them over and over, and also like any tool you're using, you can learn how to do these three things, and it just like opens up what if you just learn how to order things, like it just opens up what's possible. So I think it's also a nice place for like don't try to learn everything. Like if you learn these three, you don't have to learn that much to be able to do so much more.
Sure. Yeah, fantastic. Well, and when do you feel that some of these tools are most important to keep in mind or most useful?
I mean, honestly, I like I think like every project I do at some point, like maybe it's not in the final visualization, but like usually it is like so I would say always. And I just like they're so they're so ubiquitous. And if you start kind of paying attention to it and looking around, actually it was amazing like watching the talk with John and Alice earlier today on equity viz, and they're talking about their remake, and like they like I did like Alice like literally said like, oh, like we like here were the small multiples and here's how we use color, and then like, oh, like order was really important, order mattered. And I was like it was literally the three things. We did not talk beforehand. So
That's
it was just
awesome.
like I
I
think just
noticed
like
that
showing
too. Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, I mean, I figured your answer was going to be all the time.
Yeah.
But yeah, cool.
And again, like it might not always like I do make visualizations that have small multiples, or like it won't. And again, sometimes you get order for free. That's the kind of funky one where like either you kind of get it, like it just kind of happens, or you like really need to make sure it happens.
Sure.
But but yeah, even if I don't have it in the final viz, like probably somewhere along the way, it was definitely in the exploration somewhere.
Nice. Yeah. Another question started out with such a great talk. And then the question is there a convention for color ramps having dark or light colors associated with high or low values?
um, that's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I think that it's actually really interesting. So if you in I posted a link to the examples themselves, and there's actually a reverse option on the color schemes. It's actually interesting because not all color schemes go the same way. I think a lot of the like sequential ones tend to go light to dark, but then the family of like Veridus and Magma and Inferno and Plasma actually go dark to light, which was interesting to realize. So I don't think it's consistent. I think part of it's that it actually, one thing that was fascinating me is like, I've been doing a bunch of like heat maps using like Veridus and Plasma that are these kind of like dark to light. And especially Veridus has this like really, really bright yellow that was, as we saw. And I had convinced myself, I was like, oh, like yellow, like the high colors pop. Like Veridus is all about like yellows just pop. And then I was working on visualizations for molecules. We're actually coloring like the shapes of molecules based on these colors. And I told him, I was like, oh yeah, like make the yellow the high colors. And he's like, I really care about the high colors. I was like, make them yellow. They're totally gonna pop. I didn't think that it was actually lines on a white background. And like the yellows were like almost invisible. And I was like, oh, like the yellows pop because it's very common to have a heat map that has lots of like middle and low values and a small number of maximum values. So you have these like bright yellows against a purple background. Like they're popping because of the context, not because like yellow inherently pops by itself.
Sure.
So I think a lot of it really has to do with like what's actually in your data set affects the way that you're perceiving that color scheme, which is why color is so tricky.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. That's like a helpful additional thing to think about, right? It's not just about like what represents what, but like, yeah, how the data looks, how it's gonna, what's next to what when you're looking at it. Yeah.
And that's actually one of the things where like, I can't remember if this made it into the talk or not, but it was, I think people think about like, oh, like they're so focused on like, oh, like I want my like colors to be really quantitative and like I want to like use this like really perceptually even, but like as we know from science, going to science museums as a kid, like if you have the same exact color on a different background, you will actually perceive that exact color differently. So like if you think about that mapping the numbers, like a 7 surrounded by 10s, you're not going to think that 7 is the same number as a 7 surrounded by 5. Like you're actually going to think those are different numbers, and you won't perceive the 7s as being the same number based on what's surrounding them.
Okay, that's really interesting. Cool. I want to see that exhibit now.
Yeah. I should make the data viz version of that exhibit. I feel like it's like all those like optical illusion things like they have in like, I think the Boston Museum has a great collection.
Yeah, totally. Another question was, how do you find the sweet spot for small multiples in terms of keeping things readable and not too overwhelming for viewers?
Yeah, so I remember like one of my like transformative moments, but actually was at the crux moment where I was kind of switching from data analysis to data viz. I remember talking to a colleague and you were using ggplot at the time, and I was like, make 25 charts, like small multiples are cool. I just taken the workshop, I like thought small multiples were really cool. And he was like, no, like we'll never, like there's too many charts. And I'm like, it's one command line, like just do it. And he did it, and we were like, holy, like we have the answer now. Like there was this question that we like didn't have an answer to, and suddenly like we had an answer to, because there were 3 things happening, and it was like very clear that like half the charts were one thing, most charts were something else, and there was just like some weird charts that were doing something different. And I think we really underestimate how much we can actually pattern match. I think the key to it is like, so like with ggplot, there's like a theme void and theme minimal. Observable plot actually is pretty sparse, like has pretty minimal backgrounds by default, and doesn't and takes away the space. Like a lot of times there's repetition of like the axes line. So like observable plot drops those axes. Any tool that you're using, you can do it with. Just like I think the more charts you have, the more that you want to make the charts really data focused and pull away your grid lines, let the data be the.
Sure, simplify it. Take away the extra stuff.
Take away everything extra and then pull it back in if you need it. But I'm saying with grid lines, like pull off the grid lines and then put the ones back in that are important. Like if the number 10 is what matters, like have a grid line be 10. Don't have 20 grid lines.
Or maybe even have a grid line be 10 that's like bold or red or something if it's something really important.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think like with small multiples, like I say, go for it. Like be bold. Like try 100, try 200, see what works. It's okay. And then if it's not working, like pull off everything that isn't the data, and then just like layer it back in slowly.
Sure. Yeah.
Or change your encodings. Like if it's too like, can this other encodings be simpler?
Yeah, I think that a lot of these kind of things, right? You just kind of have to like play around and see what works, because it's not going to be the same for different data sets or different.
Yeah.
Everything looks different.
Yeah, and again, like the principles matter. Like it matters what's happening with the data. So I think that's another thing. It's just like, don't give up when you like, if you try it and then the first thing you see is like, oh, that's not working. Like that doesn't mean it was a bad idea. It just might mean that you have to like spend some time like finessing.
Sure. And when you draft for new visualizations, are there some first draft go-to charts that you usually begin with to get to the final chart?
Yeah, I think this is a combination. Like, honestly, I think one of the things I do first is really actually try to sit down with like a pen and paper and a pencil and paper and think about like, and like sketch and like what is the transformation I actually want to make? Like, what is the encoding? Like, what is important about this data and like what encoding might convey that? And I think the nice thing with that is then when I like go to use my digital tool, I like already have something in mind that I really want to make. So like even if it's not the easiest like thing out of the tool, I like am already anchored to what I want it to be. Whereas I feel like if we start with the tool, sometimes we anchor to like whatever's easiest in the tool, and there isn't this forcing function to like push you to be like, oh, I have to go like, I guess I have to go search for like, what is that API call again? Whereas I've like already sketched it, I'm like, oh, I do really want to make the thing. Like,
so now I'm going to figure out how to do it.
Yeah,
going to figure out how to make the thing.
Exactly.
Yeah, totally. There's some curiosity about if you have any pointers for capturing annotations or insights with consumers of charts.
I mean, I think that's a good question. I think it answers a couple different ways you could go with this question. I think one thing is like if I'm making a chart for somebody else or with somebody else where like they're the domain expert, a lot of it in that part is like the conversation about like, well, what is important to you? And like listening to, if they say the word like, oh, differences are important, then I'm like, okay, well, how can I think about difference in terms of the encoding, like whether it's color or multiples or whatever. And if I think if it's like later, like if it's like the chart's been made and they like want to bring that information into it, I mean, I think then it is like in some cases it's like, well, how can I, like, does it make sense to actually bake in? Yeah, I'm sorry. I was like, something just happened in the house. Yeah, like how can I bring in that into the visual encoding, or how do I bring it in as an annotation? Especially if it's for publication. But I mean, annotations are really important and hard, especially automatically.
Yeah.
Phil's been doing some cool work on like automated annotations, so we'll see what happens. A colleague, Phil, has been thinking a bit about automated annotations.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, they're hard.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah.
Much props to like all the people that do, especially like journalism viz, and make beautiful annotations. I'm just like learning how to like make arrows that look pretty. Not just pretty, like functional.
Yeah, totally. When you have the choice, how do you decide what geometries to use? Census tract versus zip code versus county, etc.
I mean, I think this also goes back to like what is important about the data, and I think there's often sometimes this tension between like the data you have and the data you ought to have to like answer the question well.
Yeah.
And really pushing yourself there. Also, like, should it even be a chart in the first place, or what's the goal of the chart? So like, should you I was actually talking to Robert Casera recently about some unemployment data, and he was like, oh, like using chart as like use the chart for navigation as opposed to like the main core visualization, which I think is also a really good idea. So you can imagine some of those like bar charts and multiples being associated with a chart that has like that's more there for navigation and support or map. So I think the key thing with maps is like, should it even be a map in the first place?
Oh, sure. I mean, like whenever there's location as part of the data, it's so tempting to just like put it on a map.
Yeah.
And that's not always the thing that's actually going to be most helpful for like what you're looking at. Right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And even though I use maps,
so tempting.
I know, it's so tempting. Like, I want to do it so badly. Like, it's just like, begging for it. And yeah, even though I use a map for this particular example, like these principles aren't just for map. Like I use this principle all the time with like bar charts and line charts. I just happen to have maps be like a familiar example that we can connect to.
Sure. And for someone who's never used Observable, how would you recommend folding it into data viz practice, and what are the pros?
So I'm going to do the since we're not doing pitches here, I'm going to kind of pass on this question of go check out the website, and there's some good materials. Check out the meetup links, and you can also send me a DM. But there's cool ways, lots of cool, like there's a lot of cool ways to bring it into your practice. Especially I love like combining inputs and plot. And you can check out the example. I mean, a great way to get started with that is just to, like, I dropped the examples. They're in the doc and they're in the chat. So you can see the examples that go along with this deck in practice, and you can see the code that goes along with that.
Nice. And Let's see. We just had another one come in. How do you know that you're showing the right amount of chart complexity and that people understand it rather than getting lost?
So I think this really depends on, like, again, like, what is the purpose of your chart? A lot of my work has actually been with people that I can actually sit next to. So I have a conversation with them, or I ask them, and I might have a conversation where I actually ask them questions like, look at this viz and like, tell me what you notice. Not like necessarily intending it as user research, but really just, I mean, it is user research, but also just to like, to hear what they notice. And sometimes they notice things that I didn't notice because like they're the domain expert and they're bringing a context I didn't have. And I've definitely done a lot of like iterating and be like, oh, like that was important to you. Like we can do more of that. I think when it's for an audience that you can't talk to, that if you're putting it out in the public, I think just thinking really nuanced, like what is the complexity and like where, in a couple ways. One, you kind of have like a complexity bank account and like, are you spending the complexity on the right things? And two, and I think actually like making these decisions, like if you just use a color spectrum out of the box, like you don't know how the person's interpreting it. Like, do they think yellow is high or do they think green is high? Whereas if you actually make these decisions and you make really clear assumptions and you label them and you like red is very high, it is over 8%. That's actually a way also of making it more clear, because then you and the other person are both on the same page. Like we know what red means. Like we have the same idea of what red means. So I think actually like being these kind of like moments of like making decisions about what's important are actually a way of bringing clarity, even when you're maybe showing more charts at a time. I think there's also just this assumption of like, oh, like more charts is more complex, but I've often found like more charts is often more simple because then each chart is doing one thing and you know what that chart is doing, as opposed to like trying to like pack more into a single chart where like then it's trying to do too many things and you have to spend time going back and forth to the legend. So actually a lot of times like, yeah, more charts is often more simple.
Sure. Yeah. Well, that's the time we have. We're going to move on to the next talk, but thank you so much, Zan, for the awesome talk and for answering all these questions.
Yay.
And yeah, I hope us run into you in an unconf later.
Yeah, thanks for being here. I can't wait for the next 24 plus hours.
Cool.
Yay, thank you. Bye.